Sometime in 1997, reports started to come out of Japan that Konami was planning to move Castlevania into the world of 3D. Castlevania was known for its tough but fair design premise. Characters had to commit to actions. Jumping, attacking, or using special weapons all carried a certain amount of risk. Jump at the wrong time and you'll be knocked into a pit. Attack an enemy in haste and you'll take a hit yourself. In the modern age, comparisons between Dark Souls and Castlevania are numerous, and in my opinion, they're spot on. I don't know if anybody ever asked Miyazaki if he was inspired by Castlevania's tough but fair philosophy when he set out to make the Souls series, but in many ways, the Souls series feels like the natural evolution of a series that rewarded patience and good decision making. Players who charge ahead and expect the game to move at their whim will be frustrated quickly, but players who carefully use what the game gives them will find a challenging game that rewards perseverance, and that's exactly what Dark Souls does, just in 3D. However, Demon Souls, the precursor to Dark Souls, didn't come out until 2009. Back in 1999, while From Software was releasing whatever the Jigoku this is, Konami was busy releasing Castlevania Moku Shiroku, or Castlevania Apocalypse, known simply as Castlevania in the West and Castlevania 64 by fans to distinguish it from the NES game. The early 3D era is the puberty years of video games as a medium. 3D technology brought new possibilities, but also new challenges for developers and players. Nintendo, for example, worried over players' abilities to think in 3D spaces, and experimented with numerous approaches in their early 3D games. Could you imagine Ocarina of Time taking place only in Ganon's castle? Or what about if the game was in first person? How about just a fairy that talks to you every 5 seconds and reminds you how to open doors? All of these things were considered as ways to not only deal with memory limitations, but to help players understand gaming in 3D. During the development of Mario 64, creator Shigeru Miyamoto said they spent months selecting things we take for granted, things like camera position and stage layout. They even considered putting the game in an isometric perspective at one point. If Nintendo had such trouble on their own hardware, then Konami had a massive task ahead of them to port their classic level-by-level series into something that would not only be 3D, but utilize 3D. And when you know it, the earliest trailer for the game is simply called Dracula 3D. From the beginning, it was obvious that Konami had very big plans for this game. While researching this video, I learned about insane cut features even I didn't know about. Everyone knows about Collar and Cornell, but do you know about the game's cut multiplayer mode? There is a lot of cut content for this game, so much so I'm going to devote an entire section of this video to it later on. But for now, picture the following. It's a rainy Friday night in 1999. You're done with school till Monday, and Mom takes you to rent a game for the weekend. Also, you may or may not be eating a Pizza Hut Big New Yorker pizza when you get home.
8 big floppy foldable slices dripping with cheese and tomato sauce that's really, really good.
After dinner, you go to your room. It's dark now, and your parents won't bother you tonight since tomorrow's Saturday. You turn on the N64 after putting in the new game from the rental place. A game simply called Castlevania. Immediately, there in the dark of your room, with the rain pounding on the tin carport roof outside, you're treated to one of my favorite gaming intros ever. Sitting there, alone in my room, with the rain outside on that tin roof, this purple-haired polygon playing a violin for me immediately drew me into his dark and edgy world. After you start the game and pick a file, you'll be asked to choose a character. Reinhard Schneider, whom the game calls heir to the Belmont clan of previous games, plays somewhat like Simon and Trevor, using a whip that he must stop in place to use, as well as a short sword for a backup weapon. Carrie Fernandez is a young magic user whose stepmother was killed by society for being a witch. Fernandez was a translation error, by the way. Her name is really supposed to be Carrie Belnades, making her a descendant of Sypha from CV3, but translation is more of an art than a tower of science, I guess. Both of these characters will venture through the castle on the way to fight Dracula, but the character you pick will never run into the other one during the story. Henry's quest in Legacy of Darkness seems to imply that they went to the castle at the same time and fought Dracula together. Kind of like how Chris and Jill explored the Spencer Mansion together in Resident Evil, but for the sake of gameplay, you don't meet the other one till the end. The comparisons to Resident Evil will continue as we go through the game, but Castlevania is at its core a level-by-level game with clear beginnings and endings for each stage with a story thrown in for good measure. After picking a character, you're treated to a dramatic text scroll introducing the characters. Reinhardt shares the blood of the Belmonts and is thus duty-bound to oppose Dracula, whether he wants to or not. Carrie, having lost her only family, sets out to use her magical gifts to end the Count's reign of terror and stop him from inflicting pain on any more children. No matter which character you choose, the first stage is always the Forest of Silence. I've decided for the sake of this review to do a full playthrough of the game and walk through with my thoughts alongside you, the viewer. I've used Reinhardt as a base, but I did a playthrough with Carrie as well, and when her level or story beat is different from Reinhardt, I'll drop it in, so don't worry, you'll be getting the entire CV64 experience. After watching these introductions, we're dropped into the Forest of Silence. Reinhardt crosses himself and asks his courage not to leave him, while Carrie states that she has no regrets. The Forest of Silence is our introduction to Castlevania in 3D, and the stage seems to have been designed to help players come to grips with the 3D jumping and climbing. Right at the beginning, 2 candles on stone pillars beckon to us, but 2 trees are struck by lightning and fall in our way. Players will therefore have to use the game's 3D jumping to hop over these safe obstacles and climb on the pillars if they want the items. After picking up the items, we run into some skeletons with TMJ and the first mini-boss of the game, this giant skeleton. If you did the jumping section earlier, you got a knife and health power-up to help you with this encounter, but the knife is the worst sub-weapon in the game and we'll soon ditch it for an axe. The enemies aren't tough, although Reinhardt will have an easier time with the big skeleton because you can control where his whip goes, whereas Carrie's orb can get distracted if you don't know how to aim it properly. After the boss, you get your first jump that matters. It's very simple, but if you mess it up, you fall into the river and have to repeat the boss fight. I'd have put a save crystal on the first ledge to keep new 3D gamers from having to do this boss fight again, but hey, it's a simple jump, I guess. After crossing the ledge and finding your actual first save crystal, you'll encounter skeletons that spawn in alongside thunderclaps. These thunder skeleton spawning mechanisms are cool, but unfortunately, it tanks the frame rate hard in the stage when they pop out of the ground. In fact, the blue skeletons later inspired Flo Rida to write his 2007 hit song Low, featuring the lyrics, "She spawned from the floor. Next thing you know, the frame rate got low, 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 low." Frame rate and skeletons aside, this level doesn't really have much to show other than some precarious platforming and a little back and forth as we open these large gates with switches. Before exiting the last gate, we're accosted by the giant skeleton again, but this time we put him down for good before entering the castle. After entering the castle and finding out there's no way back, we find ourselves
Through a room.
and make our way into an unlocked door on the side. We begin our ascent of the right tower by dodging a few spikes and whipping a few bone dragons on the way. It's nothing you haven't seen in a Castlevania game before. After Reinhardt decides to see if gravity still works in Castlevania, I restart the level and head back in. A bone dragon decides to make us into flambe, but we survive and press onward. Despite a few awkward interactions with a Medusa head and a bat, we reach the top of the level largely unharmed and are greeted by the double bone dragon, the level's boss. This guy can be annoying, but he's not too tricky if you position yourself correctly. He also has roast chicken in his boss room, so we take advantage of that to avoid death. After forcefully untangling him from the premises, we activate a lever which opens one of the portcullises in the main room. As a side note, I really enjoy saying the word portcullis. To get back down, we have to go through another area that sits between both towers. There's a few pesky skeleton enemies, but it's nothing we can't handle. Anakin Skywalker, however, would have a much tougher time. Having opened the portcullis, we are able to grab a key which unlocks the left tower.
This is the lock-picking Belmont, and what I have for you today is the left tower lock.
This tower is significantly more dangerous than the first, featuring no bottom at all and numerous tricky traps that make you stop and watch the pattern before committing to cross. Things are going well until Reinhardt again decides to test if gravity works in the left tower. And it does, so we start from our last save. This time, before we get the key, the camera gets stuck inside a solid object, having some sort of metaphysical nightmare. Back in the left tower, we get dumped by our spiky platform girlfriend, and get to do all this over again. The third time is the charm. At the top of the left tower, we're met with a cutscene where our character is taunted by the big man himself.
Upstart weakling. All who oppose the Dark Lord must die.
The grating is opened by a cutscene, so we're free to exit the level, after the camera has another existential crisis, of course. Now we've entered the villa, probably this game's most famous stage. This is what I call a walk and talk stage. There is still combat, but much of this mission plays out like Resident Evil, with us having to find items and talk to people to progress in the level. After enjoying some erotic flavor text and being harassed by Dracula's pit bulls, we enter the front of the mansion without knocking. Immediately, we find ourselves attacked by the game's first vampire. Reinhardt has a slightly harder time than Carrie with vampires because his whip attack locks him in place. This means you can't spam but have to play hit and run with these guys. Either way, we make quick work of him and loot the first floor of items. This leads us to a nice little transitory space and the Rose Garden, where I have carefully timed the playthrough so that we arrive here at 2 a.m. I did this by using the fast forward function in Project 64. Rosa tells us to leave. Reinhardt refuses to do so, so Rosa tells us we need to visit the archives, but a previous adventurer took the key. Fortunately, said adventurer, Charlie Vincent, is only about 3 doors away. This blowhard says he's the mightiest of vampire hunters and that we should leave. He also calls us an amateur. Rude. I looked at this vase of paintings to make myself feel better. Either way, he gives us the archives key, and we go to said archives. Along the way, we're stopped by another vampire who's pretending to be a human. It's interesting to note that this concept is mentioned in pre-release interviews, but it's only used here, and you're forced to fight him. At no point are you threatened with a human that you have the opportunity to trust, who turns out to be a vampire, although human versions of all the vampire enemies are found in the game's code. This battle is slightly harder due to the enclosed space, but we return him to the underworld and continue on. After some quick looting and closet calisthenics, we head to the hedge maze. Before we can get there though, we're introduced to Renan, the demon salesman. He offers us items in return for gold, but because the gold is all really Dracula's, if you spend too much at his store throughout the game, you have to fight him in an optional boss battle. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at this, it'll likely never happen to you unless you try to make it happen, as the game has so many hidden healing items and goodies, you'll probably never even need to call Renan. In the hedge maze, we meet a little boy named Malice. Just before Reinhardt can put together that malice is Latin for evil, we're attacked by the 2 stone dogs from earlier and the Frankenstein gardener, who's very upset he was cut from being a playable character. We avoid him in what's one of the worst chase sequences ever and follow Malice to the maze exit. Reinhardt tells Malice to be a man and you can do it, while Carrie somewhat callously says, "Watch out for the demons in the forest." Nothing personnel, kid. Also, this cutscene does weird things to the characters' necks, with Reinhardt and Carrie looking to the right oddly for some reason after opening the gate. This was later fixed in Legacy of Darkness, but it remains one of the best reasons to play the vanilla version of this game. Escaping grants us the copper door key, and we circle back around through the mansion to use it. We're met with a classic Castlevania tune as we go down to the cellar. The first one has a drop-down attack, but fights just like the others for the most part. After killing said first vampire, the second rises from the ground. This lady vampire can turn into mist to avoid our attacks, but we just whack her when she returns to her regular form. And the fight comes to an end with our heroes finding a hidden path in the coffin in the room. Reinhardt has to go to the underground mining tunnel, while Carrie travels through to the underground waterway. Reinhardt's level, Tunnel, begins with us falling from the ceiling into the dark depths. This stage is very confusing the first time you play it, having multiple paths and low draw distance, but the music is straight fire, so that makes it bearable. To get started, we traverse a rock crusher in the middle of the night and ride an elevator down to the River of Dreams. Reinhardt takes a moment down by the river to meet up with a Tinder match, but finds out he was caught in a web of lies.
Mary? No, you're not.
After ghosting the two spider ladies, we continue back up after jumping across some rocks in the river. The big set piece of this level is a gondola ride, which takes you through the cave as you're assaulted by enemies. After a very silly death waiting on our ride, I restart and this time manage to board successfully. We have to scale across several acid pits and navigate some more low draw distance fog, but we finally reach the sun door guarding the exit. The end of this level sees Reinhardt meeting Rosa, who attempts suicide not wanting to live as a vampire. This is where we first see Reinhardt's Christianity on display. He saves Rosa and tells her that God forbids suicide. Rosa questions this and says, "Even for a vampire?" I realize, but this is Castlevania 64 we're talking about here, but there is some nuance to Rosa's struggle to cling to what's left of her dwindling humanity. The little character development this game gives her throughout the journey all revolves around her desire not to become an unholy night creature, while at the same time struggling with the inevitability of it. Does she kill herself now while she has her rational mind, or live as long as possible as a human? Which would be the better option? Rosa also points out that Reinhardt isn't a very good vampire killer if he can't kill a vampire that looks like a child or a woman, to which he has no answer. While Reinhardt hammers out existential questions involving fictional creatures' spiritual responsibilities, Carrie has to deal with the underground waterway here instead of tunnel. Waterway, sadly, isn't a particularly interesting level. It's literally a sewer level that involves finding switches to cut off flows of water that block your way. Video games and sewer levels go together like peanut butter and jelly, Coca-Cola and peanuts, my average video view count and disappointment. Inseparable, really. There's a few spike traps and gaps to jump as we avoid acid water and lizard men, but that's really it. Your biggest enemy in the CV64 version of this level will be the wonky camera that sets itself up in very inopportune places, especially during one particularly precarious jumping section right at the end of the level. Once you make it through, though, Carrie meets a mysterious witch named Actrice. Actrice senses Carrie's enormous power and gives Carrie a choice. Serve Dracula or rot in hell for eternity. Geez, lady, we just met. Out of all this, the thing that Carrie puzzles over the most is Actrice mentioning wanting to restore Dracula to his full power. Carrie, like Reinhardt, proceeds to the castle center after this conversation.
The missile knows where it is at all times.
Both Reinhardt and Carrie visit Castle Center. The overall level objectives are the same for each character, but the enemies and NPCs found in the level will vary depending on which character you're using. This is the game's largest level, and sadly, most of it just feels like padding. The entire objective of the level is blowing up this wall in the Colosseum area so you can activate an elevator, which takes you to the end of the level. This means traipsing up and down the tower, back some odd 2 or 3 times as you gather the items that you need. One of the most annoying rooms that you have to do several times is a room filled with lizards and lockers that all must be killed to unlock the main door. Luckily, thanks to a programming oversight with level geometry, you can simply walk into this corner of the room to despawn them all instantly, and thereby unlocking the door. You're welcome. On the rest of the way there's a room with glass knights and vampires, but they aren't anything special by this point in your journey. We do meet a lizard man who's not hostile, and he gives us a key to the torture chamber. He says that we need to get Mandragora from there to blow up the walls with magical nitro. I give him the number to the local Transylvanian Sears so he can buy himself a pair of pants, and we get on our way. The next room over is filled with the magical nitro he mentioned. In said nitro room, we run into Malice, who has certainly not been a good boy. Malice asks us some odd questions before becoming antagonistic and telling us that we'll die trapped like wretches. Reinhardt again takes a moment to ponder a child named after the Latin word for evil, but is again distracted by a healing kit hidden in a nearby crate. Magical Nitro is this stage's gimmick. It's a magic potion used to create explosions, but like real-life Nitro, it explodes if it's shaken too much. While carrying it, your character can't jump or take a hit. Doing so results in spontaneous combustion. We take some magical nitro and place it on the cracked wall outside the lizard room, but like the lizard guy said, we need mandragora to detonate it, which means a long trek back through the same areas we just went through, and all of the enemies have respawned. Back to the corner it is. Most people would go and get the mandragora and bring it back, but as a longtime player, I always opt to do the second nitro run now rather than making an additional trip later on. This time, you have to cross an entire room with wonky camera angles, gear traps, and fire-breathing lizards in addition to 3 or 4 trap rooms before it. The big room with the lizards, though, separates the men from the boys. You can't be slow crossing this path because the lizards will knock you off, and you can't stand on the corners to reorient your camera because these platforms will drop to the ground, trapping you with the lizards if you take too long. Luckily, my years of time wasted on playing this game pays off, and I navigated successfully on my first try. We aren't totally out of the woods yet though. The gears in this section have very wonky hitboxes, and sometimes they blow up if you get a little bit too close to them. I found it's best to stay in between the spokes as much as possible, only moving sporadically to run across. The rest of this nitro run is thankfully uneventful, other than a member of the Motorbone Boys attempting to spoil it. The magical nitro is set for later, and I go get the mandragora to carry it all the way back up. Yes, the enemies do respawn again. We blow the wall up and enter a hidden library with a planetarium hidden in the attic. There's a unique puzzle here where you place statues in the correct location based off the planets. The clues are hidden on statues throughout the level, but if you know the colors of the planets, you can figure this out without too much trouble. Releasing this seal means that the wall downstairs can now be destroyed, and since we set the nitro earlier, all we have to do is run back and place the mandragora. Yes, the enemies respawn. Inside the wall is a big crystal. We turn it on, but unfortunately this magic also resurrects the dead behemoth in the middle of the floor. This guy charges around the arena and shoots lasers at us, but he's really just not too tough. If you can manage to destroy his upper half before his lower half, the fight ends instantly, regardless of how much health he has. Next is where things deviate a bit on the way to the level exit. Reinhardt encounters Rosa, who is now wielding a sword and is manipulated by Death into fighting Reinhardt. Rosa, unfortunately as a young vampire, has no concept of stairs, and we are able to easily destroy her by chucking axes from the top of the stairs in the corner of the room. Reinhardt again refuses to finish Rosa, and Death whisks her away to fight another day. Carrie, on the other hand, encounters the evil Actrice. Actrice, who earlier asked Carrie to join her, knows that Carrie will not. Carrie, being the total boss babe that she is, says she'll kill Actrice too if she gets in her way. Instead of taking her up on that challenge, Actrice sends the Fernandez warrior after her, a vampirized cousin of Carrie's who's been cursed to sell multi-level marketing products for eternity. The Fernandez warrior is slightly harder than Rosa, but not by much. Carrie defeats her and releases her from the curse. After these encounters, both characters' paths will again diverge as we move into 2 character-specific levels. Duel Tower, as the name suggests, is a level about duels and boss fights. There's 4 total, and each one takes place under a ceiling that's slowly falling down. Take too long and you'll find yourself crushed. Also, they didn't feel the need to put any save points in this version, so unless you're willing to go back into Castle Center and save, expect to start from the beginning after every death. Most of these bosses are just stronger versions of enemies and bosses you've already seen before, except for this first guy who I believe to be unique to Duel Tower. In between these fights, I took some time to test the sharpness of these edges, as well as admire the distance fog. CV64's stages are absolutely massive, and it's no wonder that many of them lag. After a very silly death from trying to lift in the wrong place, I restarted and put on my serious face to make it to the end. Carrie must take the opposite bridge out of Castle Center and ends up at the Tower of Science. I think this level was originally supposed to be for Collar, but more on that later. Tower of Science begins with a climb up a central tower that spits out these odd fleshy boxes at you. It's very easy to jump at the wrong time and fall down to your demise. But luckily it's not too hard with a little patience and practice. At the top, you'll enter a series of rooms with laser turrets and vats containing strange creatures. There's some more key collecting to be had too. Fortunately, the keys in this level don't require any NPC shenanigans, but are mainly just a way to make the player attempt certain platforming challenges in the level. Meanwhile, Reinhardt has moved on to the Tower of Low Frame Rates. The centerpiece of this level is a guillotine-lined tower that you must scale by doing platforming challenges on all the sides of the room. I experienced frame rates that a Windows 98 PC trying to run Crysis could beat, but soldiered on, climbing to the top while taking a moment to look at the level's unused whip swing points and think about what could have been. After taking time to ask this blood skeleton I loaned $50 to where my money was, I decided to let him off the hook and end the level. Carrie, meanwhile, is dealing with her second tower level, the Tower of Sorcery. This is without a doubt one of my favorite levels in the game. You ascend a gigantic empty void full of rainbow-colored crystals. Odd lights flicker in and out of existence while specks of diamond and glitter dance through the air. And as you climb, you'll spot several of these really cool-looking floating stained glass windows. This level is one of the reasons to go back and play CV64 even if you started with Legacy of Darkness. A lot of the graphical fidelity and layout was changed to save memory in the second version. Again, there's no boss, and the level ends after a climb to the very top, and we enter the Room of Clocks. After the platforming challenges of the two prior levels, the Room of Clocks provides a moment of solace before sending us into a boss fight with our character's specific antagonist. Reinhardt is ambushed by Death, but saved by Rosa, who takes the fatal blow for him, confirming her humanity. As she dies, Reinhardt prays with a fearful Rosa and tells her that God has forgiven our sins and she can die in peace. As a young Christian growing up in and around church in the 90s, I actually really appreciated this scene. Most games, if they represent Christian faith at all, portray it as some sort of do more good than evil in your life and then you get to go to heaven system, when in actuality it's about realizing you can't do enough good on your own. Again, it's just CV64, there's no mention of Jesus by name or any deeper theology, but it was still cool to see this on a console from a company that usually scrubbed any religious reference it could from its games. Anyway, Death can be destroyed in just a few hits with a fully powered whip, a far cry from his Castlevania 1 counterpart. He doesn't do much either except fly around and throw scythes at us, but he does have this one big attack where he summons some sort of weird demonic fish. After being beaten, he has some Geoffrey Chaucer era insults for us. Carrie, on the other hand, faces off with Actrice, who we learn murdered her own child in order to obtain eternal life in service to Dracula. I could say there's some sort of metaphor hidden in here about Reinhardt's cutscene implying God's sacrifice of his son for humanity, contrasted against Actrice sacrificing her own child for her own selfishness, but this is Castlevania 64 we're talking about. Konami Computer Entertainment Kobe didn't put that much thought into this, right? Actrice is pretty easy to deal with on easy and normal mode at least. You just run in a circle and fire charged shots in between her crystals. The bigger ones take a lot of hits to break, so you want to aim for the smaller ones. They break like the gem in a Kmart engagement ring. Carrie defeats Actrice, whose face turns monstrous before her body becomes encased in crystal and explodes, ending her bloody reign of terror. The clock tower is up next, and while it's a fairly long stage in Legacy of Darkness, here it's just a short 2 to 3 room ordeal. You'll start by climbing up this room full of gears and then cross this little room of sideways cogs. On the other side is a room that requires you to jump across suspended machinery to reach a key on the far side before climbing back up the other side to reach the door. The floor on the bottom makes it not so tough because unless you're up very high, you can just try again if you fall. After you get the key and get to the top, the level ends almost as quickly as it started. A far cry from the harder clock tower levels of older Castlevanias. After skipping up the tower, we come to a large square room where we meet Renan, who takes his leave if you haven't bought too many of his wares. If you have, you must fight him for your life. Renan is just a reskinned Death, and he has all the same attacks, so nothing really to write home about. If you arrived at the Castle Keep too late, you'll also have to fight Charlie Vincent and be put on the path to the bad ending. The only real way this would happen is if you abuse Sun and Moon cards throughout the game, but because there's really no more levels past the second or third one that requires them and most people won't know about the enemies having less health during the day, I would guess most people never even knew this was a thing unless they were trying to find it. Like older Castlevanias, the area around the Keep Tower has some goodies hidden in it, as well as the only instance of the Healing Kit's 3D model outside the Renin menu, so we load up and head inside. There's a save point here, but beware because it's the point of no return. Saving here means you'll have to start over or finish the game. Dracula appears from the old coffin to challenge us, and I gotta say, they did a pretty good job translating all those old Drac fights to 3D. Dracula teleports around the room and performs various attacks, from spitting fireballs to spewing energy waves. Like in the old games, the only way to damage him is to attack his head. After defeating him, Dracula laughs and taunts us, saying to save the world isn't so simple, hinting that something is amiss. Despite his threats, he dies in a spectacle, and the castle begins to crumble, so we make our exit. However, along the way we meet an old friend playing with a life-size My Little Pony. Finding the door to the clock tower locked, we have no choice but to ride up onto the roof where we find Malice and Fizzlepop Berry Twist. Reinhardt again takes a moment to contemplate why a kid is named Malice, which again is Latin for evil, before being interrupted by Malice himself transforming into Dracula. The one we killed was a fake. This Dracula fight isn't nearly as interesting as the fake one. He teleports into one of about 5 spots and does a canned attack. He's still only vulnerable in the head, so we just wait to see where he appears, jump up and whip him. It's pretty easy. After being defeated once again, Dracula returns to his Malice form. Finally, Reinhardt takes a moment to contemplate and understand why a child would be named after the Latin word for evil, but is again interrupted, this time by Charlie Vincent, who reveals to Reinhardt that Malice is named after the Latin word for evil because he is in fact Dracula himself. Dracula transforms himself into what can only be described as a cross between a centipede and a dragon. This is actually the most dangerous boss in the game though, because he makes literal nuclear explosions which can one-shot you if they hit you right. Most of his body is fortunately vulnerable to attack, but if you get close he sends out shockwaves or swipes at you. The best way to beat this boss is sadly just to stockpile healing items and go for a war of attrition while avoiding the nuclear blast. If you don't have the items, you'll have to run in circles around him to avoid said nuclear blast and pop in for close hits before retreating away to avoid his counterattacks. Reinhardt may actually have an easier time with this because his whip is less likely to get distracted by the nuclear orbs than Carrie's magic bolts are. Either way, after stomping this blood-sucking centipede, the castle begins to crumble into the ground, and in true Belmont fashion, Reinhardt is teleported to a cliff overlooking the castle. After watching it crumble, rose petals fall, signaling the return of Rosa, who has been freed of the vampire curse with the defeat of Dracula. They actually made a point to give her a normal skin tone here, as if to signify she's no longer amongst the undead. Rosa and Reinhardt talk about how the struggle against Dracula is eternal, and that humanity will always have to deal with him. It's very unclear whether Reinhardt exists in the proper Castlevania canon or not, but it's sad to think that likely he would be long dead by the time Julius Belmont figured out how to destroy Dracula permanently. If you finish the game with Carrie, on the other hand, you see a simple but effective ending scene where she returns to the countryside and visits her mother's grave, placing some flowers on it before looking off into the rising sun. There's much less dialogue than Reinhardt's ending, but I think it suits Carrie well. She isn't the most talkative throughout the story, and honoring her mother by destroying Dracula was what she set out to do. The love shown to her by her stepmother, contrasted against the evil Actrice showed her own blood child, is Carrie's story. Actrice slew her child to gain eternal life and was destroyed by Carrie for her evil. Carrie's stepmother gave her life to save Carrie, and then Carrie gave the gift of life to the world by destroying Dracula. Carrie's stepmother is gone, but her memory lives on, and because of one mother's sacrifice, all of humanity is free. There's also 2 bad endings if you don't reach the castle keep before Charlie Vincent. Both of these are just your character hanging out with Malice. Reinhardt and Malice just do bro stuff on horseback, but in Carrie's ending, Malice asks her to marry him, which Carrie reluctantly agrees to. Malice sinisterly mentions that this is now a binding contract, hinting at maybe he actually was evil all along, which I think anyone whose name doesn't rhyme with Ari Hernandez could have figured out at this point. Reinhardt's bad ending is just a throwaway, but Carrie's might have been a little bit more interesting at some point. There's an unused item in the game's code called the engagement ring. Its description is blanked out in the American version of the game, but if you load it up in the Japanese version, you get a note that it's a present from the devil and that just by having it, Carrie's stats are increased by 10%. Who knows how they were planning to use this, but Dracula wanting to marry Carrie was originally a much bigger part of the game during development.
I think Carrie is more enjoyable. You got Reinhardt's story with Rosa. It's a nice little weird romance thing they got going on that's slightly better than Twilight, I guess. But Carrie's is just kind of hilarious, which is Dracula kind of trolling the entire time, all to set up for this secret marriage. I take the comedy aspect from that and I give that the gold medal.
The combat and platforming in this game can be best described as very loose. Characters can run and jump in 8 directions and attack mid-air, so you have a lot of freedom in combat to move around enemies in their attacks. Characters also have one main strong attack and a quick weak attack for taking out close-range enemies. The main attack can be upgraded 2 times by finding power-ups dropped from enemies. Reinhardt uses the Vampire Killer Whip, and he has to stop in place to whip like his Belmont ancestors. His side weapon is a short sword that he pulls from a sheath on his side. Carrie fires a weak magic bolt, but she can hold down the attack button to charge it into a much stronger homing bolt. Her side weapon is 2 magic pool rings that she uses to swipe at enemies with. Sub-weapons also make a return. All of the classic Belmont sub-weapons are here minus the stopwatch, although cut content in the game's files reveal that a wooden stake, rose, and garlic were all considered for sub-weapons at one point. Sadly, of the sub-weapons that are here, they aren't very balanced. The axe and the cross are so all-purpose, you really won't go wrong by keeping them around. I tend to lean towards the axe just because the cross has such a high jewel cost, jewels being this game's version of hearts. Said axe is thrown in an arc just like earlier games. It does a good chunk of damage and it doesn't drain your jewels overly fast. Once you learn to space it correctly, it can hit nearly anything you need it to, and it tends to home in on enemies if you throw it while facing them. The cross also hits fairly hard and it even comes back for a second hit, but the 5 jewels required to use it is seldom worth it if you have the axe, which only asks you for 2 jewels for its services. The knife is very weak and fairly slow, so there's really no reason to use it. Like other games, it flies straight at enemies from a distance, but so what? Your main weapon usually has more than enough range to hit enemies. Lastly, the holy water is better than the knife, but highly situational. It's very useful for immobile enemies or enemies that come directly to you, but usually the axe can just handle that. One encounter in particular the holy water shines in is the Cerberus fight outside the villa. You can throw down holy water and stand in it to keep them from getting close to you. If I'm feeling fancy, I'll pick it up before I go to the villa. The combat does have a lock-on system, although it's not really explained how to use it. Enemies will often have a targeting reticule pop up over them, and that means your character is targeting them, so sub-weapons or main attacks will go in their direction. Sometimes. It's definitely no Z-targeting, but it gets the job done. Legacy of Darkness later improved on the lock-on function, and it explains how to use it in boss fights where it's needed. Overall, the combat is good, but it feels too loose, and that often makes it a bit too easy, especially once you've gotten used to the game. It feels like a very, very early Dark Souls, but with jumping and attacks that are much less committal. You never really have to worry about overcommitting to attacks like you do in the old 2D Castlevanias. Next, let's take a look at the game's day and night system. A pre-release interview with GamePro magazine makes a point to mention that the game has a day-night system, and it will impact the game heavily. Getting trapped in certain areas based on the time of day, and deciding how best to travel based on the time of day are all things that are mentioned as features. But how does this translate into the final game? Well, some of this stuff is technically true, but not near as epic as it sounds on paper. The clock in the corner of the HUD tells you the time. 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. is day, and 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. is night. The sun and moon do cycle above you, and the lighting does change to show the difference, even while indoors, which is very nice. Some levels, like Castle Center, even change to show a more reddish tint during the evening hours when the sun is going down, which is really cool for a game of this era. Likewise, there are some rooms and levels that change depending on the time. In the villa, for example, this outdoor breezeway can have rain or a full moon depending on the time of the day. As far as traveling at day versus night, You really don't have a choice if you want to progress in the game, although there are a few time-based events that you need to work around in your playthrough. It's not like you pick a time of day to set out like you're playing Oregon Trail or anything though. Most infamously, you can't meet Rosa in the Rose Garden unless you enter it from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. Then, to get the key she tells you about from Charlie Vincent, you need to talk to him during the day because his Giga Chad self sleeps in a bed in Dracula's castle at nighttime. Also, as promised, the game does have doors that only open during the day or night, but they don't really trap you. Most of them are just used to make sure you access a cutscene at the correct part of day. For example, the scene where you see the fake Dracula, the door has a moon symbol on it, and the scene where Rosa burns herself in sunlight is preceded by a sun door. I guess they realized that if you opened an optional sun door and saw it was too dangerous or whatever, you just turn around and leave. The gameplay isn't such that you'd spend so long in an area you'd find yourself trapped behind a sun or moon door, and if you were in really dire straits, you'd just sit at the door and wait till it opened again. No problem. The in-game time already moves fairly briskly to ensure you aren't waiting for hours to do something. So to make the getting trapped concept work, you'd have to make it go even faster so that the player got caught with his pants down, or make it go slower so that you were actually giving up a long amount of time to go back through the door. But neither one of these is very fun in actual execution. They also mentioned enemies that would be stronger at night. And actually, this is in the final game, although most casual players won't ever notice it. You see, at night, enemies get a buff to their total health, which makes them harder to kill. Let's Player Evil Tim estimated that enemies get 125% health at night based on the extra hits it takes to kill the crystal switches in the Tower of Sorcery, which the game counts as enemies. I guess it's possible their attacks might hurt more or something as well, but I'm not sure of a reliable way you could test that in this game. So sadly, the day-night cycle concept doesn't really pan out like it was supposed to. I know the technology wasn't really there, but when I read this interview, I thought this game was going to be about this epic days and weeks-long journey to the castle, where you had to decide whether to travel at day or night, plan carefully when you sat out. But in the final game, it just isn't that game. Early concept art does show a village in front of the castle, so perhaps at one point you were going to start in the countryside and make your way to the castle rather than starting right outside it? But who knows? Also, many dead NPCs in the first stage have flavor text mentioning a nearby village, and Cornell's story in Legacy of Darkness shows a fully modeled one at the beginning. So this mysterious village may have been cut fairly late in development. So how about that platforming?
Of the game, as an action platformer, the platforming should be looked at a little more thoroughly, and I think having it become more painful actually just makes you care and actually give effort towards the platforming, and therefore it actually ends up being more memorable, even though it might not be in the best way, but it'll actually make you care and feel actually rewarded when you do get through a place that may have killed you once or twice or 3 times, etc.
A major contention of this game is always the camera and the platforming. The platforming itself actually works pretty well, but the camera in vanilla Castlevania 64 doesn't do you any favors. This was heavily rectified in Legacy of Darkness, but most people that couldn't master the camera here probably never bothered to try LOD. And to make it worse, the first 2 levels are filled with do-or-die platforming. You have to master the game's somewhat loose approach in these early hours, or you're going to have a bad time when and if you reach the later levels. Reinhardt's tunnel level in particular is filled with trips across acid pits and very suspicious camera angles. Again, most of these were made better in Legacy of Darkness. I'll present to you 2 situations. A platform that's almost outside of your character's max jump range, or a set of free-floating platforms that you have to leapfrog across. In the Castlevania 64 engine, I'm choosing the first one every single time, as the camera can make it very hard to judge the amount of oomph you need to put on the joystick to correctly hit the middle platform in the second example. The developers must have been aware that it could be tricky to jump onto tiny platforms and stop your momentum, because many of the jumping sections in this game involve platforms that you will have to catch with your hands and pull yourself onto. Both playable characters thankfully have magnet hands, and if they are in midair near a platform, they will almost always latch onto it if they make it anywhere remotely close with the jump. Getting up onto said platform is one thing that changes from CV64 to Legacy of Darkness. In CV64, to get up on a ledge, You always press up on the joystick, no matter what the camera angle or direction. Legacy of Darkness made it so that you press in the direction of the ledge to get up, which will often be up, but if the camera is to the side, for example, you need to press left or right to get up onto the platform. Both work just as they should once you get them down pat, and most CV64 players consider the two games' approaches simply a matter of preference. The developers also did some clever trickery to make sure both characters can work across all the levels. Reinhardt is taller than Carrie, but Carrie's grab box extends above her head to the same place as Reinhardt's. This is to assure that she can grab onto any platform he can. It looks silly in some situations, but if you use hacks to play as Carrie on Reinhardt's levels, she can complete them with no trouble. Many of the game's detractors note the difficulty in controlling momentum and the camera's odd position, making it hard to judge jumps. You combine those things with an early hours part of the game being highly platform dependent, and you have a recipe for a bad experience with the game. I've heard the game's supporters, of which I am one, say that you just gotta stick it out and play the later levels. The end of the game is great. But how many later levels have to be good for a game to be good? What's the balance on good to bad levels to make a game good or bad? Everyone always calls the island section of Resident Evil 4 a slog, but it's still one of the best games ever, and I suppose it is true that normally you want to put your best levels and mechanics at the front to really hook in players to the game. CV64 kinda does the opposite by putting in two fairly ho-hum switch-pulling platforming levels front and center, and then throwing you into Villa, a level that's closer to Resident Evil than Castlevania. After you beat the Villa though, the game becomes almost exclusively platforming and combat, save for the wacky magical nitro shenanigans in the castle center. Everything in those first two levels is simple to do and teaches you core mechanics, grabbing ledges, how to interact with the environment. There's tons of drop items to show you how they work. It's basically two tutorial levels. I mean, look, this is the very start of the game. Two trees fall on your path with candles on the other side. This is a safe way to make the player experiment with jumping, grabbing, and pulling before there's a risk of death. The problem is that the lesson drags on through two levels. Or maybe they just didn't know how to start the game. I don't know. They should have left in whip swing points. In an interview with Takeo Yukushiji in GamePro magazine early in CV64's development, a very epic picture of what became a somewhat simplistic level-by-level game is painted. The article portrays CV64 as this epic journey through the countryside to Dracula's castle. It mentions becoming a vampire and playing the game this way, encountering other playable characters as helpers or hindrances, having to decide whether you would travel by night or day, or even a multiplayer battle mode where you fight other characters. Obviously, much of this got cut or was extremely watered down for the final release. It's a story we've heard with other N64 games. Developers overestimated what was possible on the system or found out they didn't have the resources to implement them in time. CV64 itself has little hints that it was rushed out the door all around it. For example, finishing the game and unlocking a costume tells you that you can change the costume by using the 3D stick, which is just a very silly early way to refer to the game's control stick. The same text pop-up refers to Reinhardt by his last name, Schneider. During early development, he was known as Schneider Belmont. It almost seems like this text was written before his name was even fully decided on. The early Dracula 3D trailer also shows Reinhardt using his whip to swing across lava. The only place in the game with lava is the Tower of Execution level, and wouldn't you know it, the now unusable whip swing points are still stationed above the game's platforming sections. Whether they never got used or they were hard to use and turned off is anyone's guess, but I have no doubt that that's what these were originally intended for. There's also been a ton of beta content for this game discovered over the years by people like Punk7298, B-Squo, Liquid Cat, and even myself. If you want a full picture, you gotta check out the Cutting Room Floors page on the game. There's a working level select menu from a game expo still working in the code. The developers originally wanted 4 characters, each with their own campaign and intersecting stories, but for the final game you'll only find 2. But by changing a certain value, you can make Collar and Cornell's names appear in the menu where your character's name should be. Now here's Editor Trent for some rapid fire releases. There's a test grid that's a bunch of squares, unused items and status effects, unused animations, unused sub-weapons. Malice was going to have a sword at some point. Garlic! Save crystals were going to be in candles like ink ribbons. unused ending messages, film reel effects, and more. The holy grail of all CV64 cut content would of course be Collar. This Frankenstein's monster of a character used a shotgun in one hand and a chainsaw in the other. While Cornell eventually came back for Legacy of Darkness, Collar was rumored for years to have been worked into the Frankenstein Gardener monster. And earlier this year, B. Squo confirmed this by breaking into the game's files. All of the Gardener animation files are named with a prefix of Collar, confirming what work they had done on this character was repurposed into this enemy. Had this guy been playable, he was supposed to have his own sub-boss, the uniquely named Collar 2. To date, only one picture of Collar 2 concept art exists. No doubt, Collar would have fought this character on top of the Room of Clocks where the other characters fought all their nemeses. I've always held the theory that each of the castle's 4 towers were originally meant to be for one of the original 4 characters. Cornell would have gone to Dual Tower since he fought with Melee, and all the enemies in this level are his fellow Lycans. Reinhardt would have gone to the Tower of Execution, hence while it had the whip swing points in the original game. Carrie would have gone to the Tower of Sorcery as a magic user, and Collar would have gone to the Tower of Science since he's a Frankenstein's monster. No doubt he would fit right in with the Tower of Science and its vats of artificially created beings and other unholy fusions of flesh and steel. Again, there's a ton more interesting things being found in the game's code every day. I highly recommend checking out the Cutting Room Floors page on the game, or hopping into the Tech Talk tab of the CV64 Speedrun Discord to see what's being found today. After Castlevania 64 was released and the dust settled, Konami started to release info about a Castlevania Special Edition, or according to some sources, a Castlevania Director's Cut. This of course would come to be known as Castlevania Legacy of Darkness in the West, or Cornell no Gaiden when it released in Japan. To call this a director's cut would be semi-accurate, as there are no doubt things in here that were cut from the original due to time constraints, but some of the things that have been added back in are heavily changed from the original concept. I don't necessarily say that as an always positive thing either. It's like they wanted to add the original ideas back in, but remembered, oh yeah, we cut this stuff because it was going to be time consuming and difficult to make, and so they just added in 60% effort versions of said content. For example, it's well known that Konami wanted to add 4 playable stories in Castlevania. In Legacy, they reintroduced the 4-character idea, with Cornell reimagined as the main protagonist and Collar being reworked into Henry. And it's cool that Cornell is back, but sadly, he's undercooked. Originally, Cornell was supposed to be a martial artist character who could also turn into a werewolf. Instead of putting in the time to design a melee character, they just gave him a generic energy wave as his main attack. He can also turn into a werewolf as originally planned, but sadly they didn't put too much effort into it. Turning into a werewolf makes your red jewels start to tick down to 0. There's no way to turn it off either. Once you're a wolf, your subweapon ammo is gone unless you're turned back by a cutscene or some other special circumstance. The upside is that your attacks now do insane damage. I'm talking about in boss fights in seconds levels of damage. It's too bad you still have to use the energy wave. There's no unique mechanics or attacks, just stronger versions of what you have. Cornell, like Reinhardt and Carrie, does have a secondary attack, and to Konami's credit, it is a melee claw swipe, but it's nothing you'd ever want to use outside of getting bats or other close-range pesky enemies off of you. All this makes it sound like I'm dumping on Legacy, but it's quite the contrary. It's my favorite N64 game ever. Well, except for that one. It's a great N64 game that not only fixes bugs and camera angles from CV64, but gives you a great amount of content to check out. A lot of reviews online call Legacy a prequel because Cornell's story takes place before the other characters, but I really don't see the game as a prequel. It's more so that the characters' campaigns all work together to tell one complete story. Cornell shows how Dracula was resurrected, Henry shows how the church rescued the kidnapped kids, and Reinhardt and Carrie's quest detail Dracula's ultimate defeat. Cornell's quest is obviously supposed to be front and center, so let's talk about what it brings to the table. When you open the game and start a new file, you'll be presented with a now expanded character select screen, but 3 of the playable characters are grayed out and have to be unlocked. Cornell is the only choice you get from the start, at least for the USA version. The Japanese release later made it so you could play as Henry from the start as well. Starting Cornell's quest gives us a brand new cinematic cutscene of Gilles de Rais walking through the castle on his way to some ritual. It looks a little thrown together, and it probably was, but it's still impressive for the CV64 engine. The game phrases this opening like it's going to reveal some secret backstory or piece of mystery that was left unexplored by vanilla Castlevania 64, but honestly, the original CV64 stories were already self-contained and no more story setup was really needed other than what was given. What I think this game is really trying to hint at is that it's telling the story of how Dracula was resurrected this time around, and what Actrice, death, and the fake Dracula had to do with it. Cornell's story introduces a few new concepts. For example, Cornell is a man-beast. They're basically people who can turn into various types of monsters, but decided to seal the power away and live with humans instead of being outcast. Cornell, however, is special, because by beating himself with a cat of nine tails on a mountain for a year, he was able to re-unlock the power and transform into his beast form at will. Upon returning home, he finds that his adoptive sister Ada has been kidnapped by Dracula's minions and his home village set ablaze, so he sets off to the castle to get her back. Out of the 4 characters in this game, Cornell's quest is the longest and he has the most exclusive levels. He has to clear nearly every level the other characters get, plus some of his own. The only levels he doesn't go to are Castle Center, Tunnel, and Waterway. I'll go over the new levels briefly, but I also want to mention that most of the levels from CV64 have been totally remixed into brand new layouts that keep the same theme but improve the performance of the areas. Cornell's quest starts with a brand new stage, Foggy Lake. Foggy Lake is a stage everyone but Henry goes to. It says Foggy Lake, but 99% of the action takes place on this creaky old galleon floating in said lake. I'm not sure who thought that building a galleon in the middle of a lake was a good idea, but hey, it's Drax money. He can do what he wants with it. The stage is meant to teach you jumping and basic combat, as well as how to use the check button to hit switches. Once you make it down to the hull, it gets pierced by a claw and begins flooding, forcing you to make your way up quickly to escape. Although the water never really rises past a certain point, so you have all the time you need here in truth. On the outside, we run into the game's first boss, Leviathan. The Leviathan is definitely one of the more involved bosses in the game, commanding a unique camera angle and the ability to break away pieces of the stage. He wouldn't be too dangerous if not for his homing blast attack, which makes the water explode under you. He still won't be too much of a roadblock unless you're playing on hard mode, as you'll have very few healing attacks at this point, and he can kill you in just a few hits. Once this guy's toast, the gate opens and the level ends. After getting off the boat, the game throws a slew of remix levels at you. Forest of Silence has been heavily changed layout-wise, but the main challenge is still navigating the forest to find switches. I recommend using this hidden wall the developers place by one such switch, which lets you go directly to the end of the level. The boss here is exactly the same as it was in CV64. In the castle, we'll meet the personal antagonist of Cornell's quest, his former friend Ortega. Ortega is also a man-beast, however he has turned to Dracula to re-unlock his secret power. Instead of being straightforward, Castle Wall now revolves around finding a missing switch handle and moving portcullises up and down to open the way to the villa. This puzzle, however, has the depth of a puddle and will likely only end up making you go through one tower an extra time before you find your way to the next level. Once Cornell does reach the villa, you'll find that different doors are locked and open versus what they were in Castlevania 64. This time, the plot of the stage revolves around finding Mary, the wife of Master Oldry.
Mary?
And hearing about her desire to have her son Henry escape from her now vampiric husband. You'll find Henry in the hedge maze, and when you do, it starts one of the worst escort sections in gaming history. Seriously, this section alone is one of the reasons I seldom come back to Cornell's quest. Henry's AI makes Ashley Graham look like ChatGPT. He runs at least 3 times slower than you do, and if you get too far ahead of him, he just yells, "Don't leave me!" and stands in place while the Frankenstein gardener cuts him up like Peter Murphy opening up for Bobby Darin at Edward Scissorhands' house. The Malice chase, while not a landmark in gaming, was about as perfect of an escort sequence as a game like Castlevania 64 could have. You're not really escorting Malice, you're really just trying to catch up to him while navigating a maze and fighting dangerous monsters. For all we know about Malice, he could have actually just been trying to get you killed, which I think is a neat theory. But here, you're actually having to escort and protect Henry to the same place you chased Malice to. But Henry, unlike Malice, seems to have barely any real drive to live and walks about as slow as possible. This means you have to play stop and go station with him for about 5 or 6 minutes, while taking time to periodically knock out the chainsaw gardener who runs faster than he does. To make things worse, if you don't find 2 arbitrarily hidden crest halves throughout the level, you get to go exploring around again before you're actually able to finish the level. As the level ends, you'll fight Gil de Reese, but he escapes before Cornell can deal the coup de grace, and after an appearance from Actrice in death, the level comes to an end, and we go to our next Cornell exclusive stage, Outer Wall. This is the second totally new level Legacy of Darkness throws at you. Outer Wall sees you scaling the top edges of the castle while avoiding blade traps and rendering fog. It's short, and other than making use of Legacy's very slow ledge hang mechanics, it's not too bad. It ends with a CS Soar surfing level and then a showdown against a new boss exclusive to Legacy, the Harpy. Fortunately, the werewolf form makes short work of the Harpy, and then because there's a cutscene after, you can save your jewels. Outer Wall was perfect in that it was a quick little level that didn't overstay its welcome while showcasing something new. Art Tower is a terrible level based around going into the menu to use Sun and Moon cards. The background music for this level is the sinking old sanctuary from Castlevania Bloodlines, but that's really all it has going for it besides some nice graphics here and there. I appreciate the new level, but the design is awful. Who thought a bunch of doors based on the time of day was a good idea for an action platform game? It's not like there's a puzzle to solve, you just use a sun card for a sun door and a moon card for a moon door, and then reverse the process when you go back through. No skill at all to get past, and no skill at all was used to design this. There are some decent platforming sections on the other side of the doors, but if that's where the challenge is supposed to be, then why even put the sun and moon doors? This would have been a perfectly fine art and ancient treasure themed level without the sun and moon door stuff. The level feels like it could have been a cut level meant for the original game that was removed once they saw how bad Sun and Moon Doors played out in actual gameplay. Anyway, that nonsense aside, Tower of Ruins is next, and it's an honest-to-goodness maze level. The first half of the level has you using maps on the floor to find switches in a labyrinth with trap floors that send you back to previous sections. The second involves navigating a room full of crumbling ruins. The second section could have been salvaged if it wasn't quite so finicky. It's not so much about clever jumping, but learning where the floor will fall out from under you and then going back and avoiding that area the next time. After this level, there's no more new levels, only CV64 remixes. Tower of Science starts off the same, with a climb up a tower spitting out blocks, but you'll notice right away the lowered graphical fidelity and draw distance that's been used to improve the game's performance. After you get to the tower, you'll find several new sections that involve dodging turrets and a boss fight with a control room crystal in the center room. The werewolf form again makes quick work of it. Next up is Dual Tower. The concept of Dual Tower is exactly the same. Platforming challenges interspersed with boss fights against Lycan enemies. Cornell, however, will find Ortega here, who again taunts us before sending us to fight another fellow man-beast, this one who could not control his power and became a total monster. Tower of Framerate Execution was one of the worst levels in the original game performance-wise, with near single-digit frame rates in places. It was, however, one of the most impressive, a large open area highlighted by a center tower spanning several levels. The original level revolved around scaling the tower in the center of the room by navigating platforms on the room's edges. The Legacy version has been reworked into a level that feels very much like classic Castlevania. You go from room to room, dodging traps and enemies, in what's a brief but enjoyable experience. It's not near as interesting as the original level was, but it runs very well while keeping the lava and blood theme of the original. It's really not bad platforming at all, but not quite as visually impressive as the looming giant tower from the original. After we finish the Tower of Execution, the Tower of Sorcery is up next, and it's largely the same level. Graphical fidelity has been lowered slightly for performance, and some of the jumps are easier with new crystal platforms in places, but it's largely still a stage about climbing up crystals to reach the top of the tower. After this, the game starts to reach its climax. You'll fight Ortega here just like you did Death and Actrice in the original. Ortega turns into a chimera and you must destroy each of the heads to stop him. They put some actual effort into this fight, as each head has specific attacks that cause different effects. Destroying that head removes the attack. After beating Ortega, he becomes a human again and says he regrets what he did to the villagers, but he's happy he got to fight the real Cornell. He says there also may still be time to save Ada from being sacrificed. I'm not sure if that makes it okay, but whatever floats his late galleon, I get.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
Heading into the clock tower, this stage has been heavily expanded with multiple new rooms that require climbing spinning towers to find exit keys. Nothing here is particularly bad, but after all those crappy Cornell levels, you'll probably be wishing for a quick to-the-point clock tower level like CV64 had. And sadly, you won't find it. Cornell finds Ada here just stashed haphazardly on a random ledge, but she's taken away before he can rescue her. With no choice, he heads to the castle keep. Cornell's quest doesn't have a bad ending, so there's no way to fight Charlie Vincent here. You will still, however, have to fight Renan if you spent too much gold with him throughout the game, and no, they didn't bother updating Renan's dialogue for Cornell. After entering the throne room, you fight the fake Dracula from Castlevania 64, but the game calls him Dracula, so I don't know if that's just like what Cornell thinks, so the subtitles say Dracula, or that this Dracula is the actual Dracula, just reusing the fake Dracula's model to save resources. You beat him the same way, however. And instead of a castle escape sequence, defeating him nets you a boss battle with maybe Dracula Ultimate? Maybe fake Dracula Ultimate? Who really knows? Anyway, maybe Dracula Ultimate actually looks kinda cool, but they had to go and screw it up by making this battle have unique mechanics. It's not a test of anything you learned during the game, but just a test of how well you can walk along the X-axis and shoot energy waves at the right time. Once you beat this tool, he starts to be pulled back into hell and threatens to take Ada with him. Cornell, in a bit of quick thinking, astral projects his wolf self from his body into the crystal to take Ada's place, allowing him to finally rescue his adopted sister and escape the castle at the cost of his wolf form. Cornell and Ada meet up with Henry, who somehow remembered how to breathe on his own long enough to get out of the castle, and they resolve to start a new life together. Cornell does take a moment to reflect on Ortega, Ada, and himself as a person, worrying about Dracula's words, but Ada implies she already knows they aren't really blood relatives and that he shouldn't worry about it, so GG, I guess. After the credits are done, another cutscene shows Death, Gildereese, and Actrice in the throne room of the castle, where they sacrifice Cornell's man-wolf power, revealing this is what they were after all along. Ada was just a decoy. Cornell's man-wolf power was what was truly needed to resurrect the true Dracula. Next, we're greeted with another text box which says not to despair because 2 youths with the power to fight the devil will be born. This of course referring to Reinhardt and Carrie. Overall, Cornell's story isn't horrible. The revelations about Ada being a child of those who Cornell's kind killed is interesting and a twist, but it's not explored enough to be given too much weight. Once you finish Cornell's quest, you'll get a notification that you can now use Henry. Henry's quest is sort of a bonus mode that you use to unlock other things in the game. The introduction tells us that Henry is sent by the church to rescue the children Dracula's minions kidnapped while they were looking for Malice. The catch is that you only have 7 days to do it, because by the end of that time, Reinhardt and Carrie will have defeated Dracula, and his castle will crumble to the ground, taking the kids and you with it. There are a total of 7 kids hidden throughout 7 levels from the other character stages: Forest of Silence, Castle Wall, Villa, Outer Wall, Tunnel, and Waterway. The kids are hidden in semi-obscure places, and each one you find unlocks a new feature in the game. The new features you can unlock are Hard Mode, Reinhardt and Carrie's quest, and alternate costumes for every character except Henry himself. The neat thing about Henry's quest is that it's fairly open-ended. It's possible to enter and exit levels without having to find the child hidden within it, and the game lets you travel between all of them freely as long as you have time. Henry will have to fight the bosses of certain levels to get out of them the first time, but this is good because Henry is hands down the strongest character in the game. Remember Collar, the Frankenstein guy who was supposed to use a shotgun and a chainsaw that got cut from the original game? Henry uses what was obviously supposed to be his shotgun but repurposed to fire like a pistol instead. His pistol has insane range, great damage, and the reload animation can be skipped by swinging his sidearm. He can also pick up power-ups to make his gun even stronger. Henry is just a great bonus mode character. Very strong, but because of his objective, it's still a challenge. It's a great mix of giving you something new while making you feel strong as a reward for clearing the main game. Henry's mode also has a little bit of effort put into it. There's 7 kids to find, and the ending changes depending on how many of them you've saved after the 7 days is up. And yes, there's an ending where you fail to save any of them. The biggest problem Henry has is that originally he was supposed to be a chainsaw-wielding, shotgun-toting, Frankenstein's monster of a character, but instead he's a guy with a shotgun pistol who's just Reinhardt with an armor texture slapped on the top half. I think it's safe to say that if Collar had been completed, he'd play very similar to Henry, but who knows how the chainsaw arm would have worked in practice. Perhaps this is why he was dropped. Why would you use a chainsaw melee attack when you have a gun that could hit from range. Anyway, after you finish Henry's quest, you'll unlock Reinhardt and Carrie's quest for play in Legacy of Darkness. After you unlock these two, they play through the same story they did in CV64 with the addition of the Foggy Lake level and a few new bosses thrown in. It's really cool that they managed to get both of these guys in here, but sadly completing the game with them is really just to say that you did. Once you finish the game with Reinhardt and or Carrie, you get the full story of Castlevania 64's arc, but nothing else. It would have been neat to see one final unlockable for clearing all 4 stories, but the game was probably nearing its memory limitation as it is with all the additional content. So which version should I play if I've never played either? Well, that depends on what you want and the kind of resolve you have. If you're a Castlevania freak who wants to experience the entire series, go ahead and start with CV Vanilla and then move on to Legacy of Darkness. You'll likely appreciate the nuance between the two of them. If you're just looking to casually experience this game, start with Legacy, and if it leaves you wanting even more, go check out CV64's version of events. I will admit that doing this review really made me see the differences between the two releases and gave me a greater understanding of the opinion of people who don't like Castlevania 64. Both are great games once you master their quirks, but CV64 is definitely the more unforgiving game and usually for the wrong reasons. You see, Legacy not only added a ton of new content, but also many subtle changes to controls and camera angles to make the game more enjoyable. If you spent most of your time playing Legacy over the original release like I have, it's hard to imagine why anyone could be so opposed to CV64. But if you only played the original releases and never Legacy, it's a big difference. Take for example this section in Castle Wall. This platforming section is made needlessly harder by an odd camera angle that makes it harder to judge your jump and momentum. Legacy moves the camera a little bit to be closer to you and centers the player to make it easier to see where you're trying to jump. Also, don't say Legacy didn't do anything for Reinhardt and Carrie. This section of underground waterway had notoriously awful camera angles, which made it very easy to fall into the acid water, but Legacy makes the camera follow Carrie closer so that it's still challenging, but you won't fall off because you couldn't see what you were doing. A lot of reviews of Legacy of Darkness were also dismissive or negative because they said it was what the game should have been in the first place. And that's probably true, but is it a reason to dismiss an entire game? Can a game truly exist in a vacuum, independent of its release price and the company that made it? I get it, you don't want to pay full price for another title that's what the title you paid for the first time should have been. And you'd be right for feeling that way. But in a vacuum, does that make Legacy of Darkness a bad game if you don't take into account the purchase price? All these are definitely great discussion questions in gaming, especially in today's world of DLC and day one patches. If you're talking about the game, however, in a vacuum, Legacy still has some odd quirks about its controls and camera angles, even after all the fixes, but I think a lot of people never tried it because they wrote it off after they didn't like CV64. If I had to turn all this into a pro and con list for Legacy of Darkness, I would say that in its favor, Legacy adds 2 new characters, remixes old stages to fix performance issues, reintroduces content cut from the original release, reworks the camera and climbing mechanics to be more player-friendly, and uses Henry mode to unlock things as opposed to finding special crystals hidden in the level. Some negative things might include Cornell's wolf form and his new levels, which are all fairly undercooked in my opinion. Collar is also dropped for Henry, who is ironically a Frankenstein's monster of Reinhardt and Collar's mechanics. Carrie and Reinhardt's quest don't really get enough love to justify their inclusion other than just being there to be there, and you have to use the low-res mode or the game becomes unplayable on console. The list seems about even, but the good really does outweigh the bad, at least in a vacuum. You can't have Castlevania without music. The series is always lauded for its bombastic, catchy tunes. Even the worst CB game will have a pretty killer soundtrack. So is Castlevania 64's OST any good? To that I'd say, yes, it's a good soundtrack, but it's not like the others. You're really comparing apples to oranges here. Other Castlevania games create catchy level themes with gothic overtones and have them repeat proudly as you play throughout the level. Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness opt to use sound more as something to create atmosphere rather than something that's made to be part of the play experience and front and center. My guess is they felt like you'd spend more time exploring in a 3D environment, so the music needed to be less intrusive to avoid becoming repetitive. In Vanilla 64, for example, the first level of the game, Forest of Silence, is true to its name and features no music at all, but rather starts off during a thunderstorm with ambient wind and rain sounds that play in the background, broken up only by the occasional wolf howl or thunderclap. It's an odd but effective choice for a series that's used to starting off with bangers like Vampire Killer, Beginning, and Dracula's Castle. Silent Madness, played during the Villa level, is the perfect example of a song that fits the level, is well named, and is enjoyable to listen to. This quiet but unnerving song plays as you walk through the vampire-infested halls of the villa. And given how long it took first-time players to beat this level, everyone remembers it fondly. It's Castlevania 64's signature song for sure, and when they put Cornell in Castlevania Judgment, a remix of this song became his theme for the game. My personal favorite track in the game is Invisible Sorrow, played during Reinhardt's tunnel level. It's not the usual bombastic gothic overture, but a sad march backed up by an absolutely fire snare drum beat. The N64 games opt to reuse the series' classic tunes more sparingly than its predecessors. For example, Bloody Tears and Vampire Killer are really only heard in music cues and other zingers heard during cutscenes. Dance of Illusions is used for the fight with a fake Dracula, and they added Sinking Old Sanctuary in Legacy of Darkness for the stage music and art tower, but that's it as far as old series tunes goes. People just expect Castlevania games to remix their old library, but this game really tried to stand out on its own while respecting its source material, and I can respect that.
It was a little scary at first, because even after the first giant skeleton fight, it was more terrifying than I would like it to be, but I think it's usually nice getting over your fears. It's like going on that roller coaster that seems scary, but once you go on it, it's a fun time, and CV64 was definitely the same way, for sure.
Some people claim that CV64 and Legacy were like a toddler taking their first steps. Clumsy, bumbling games stumbling into 3D. You'll often see these games listed on worst 3D transitions ever list. But I disagree with those takes. In reality, CV64 and Legacy are the most accurate 3D successors of Castlevania. If we look at Castlevania up until that point, most of them had a few things in common. I say most because oddballs like Simon's Quest are a thing. But most of them were level-by-level games, structured as a journey deeper and deeper into Dracula's castle, featured a Belmont who may or may not be assisted by some other characters, were games about jumping and attacking correctly to avoid damage. CV64 has clear level ends and beginnings. It even pauses to restore your health just like the old games after the level is over. There's a whip-wielding Belmont as well as other supporting characters in both games. Other attempts at Castlevania in 3D include the PS2 games Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness, as well as the Lords of Shadow series. I really like both of the PS2 games, but they're honestly closer to dungeon crawlers than they are Castlevania games. Lament of Innocence is like Diet Devil May Cry, with the player walking from copy-pasted room to copy-pasted room to fight all the enemies before moving on to the next. The gameplay is a little more nuanced than that, but it just doesn't feel like a Castlevania game. Curse of Darkness spiced up the room layout and the story a little bit, but it's still largely a dungeon crawler, and Dracula's Castle is a level at the end rather than a set of levels that the whole game takes place in. Lords of Shadow does the level by level thing again, but it takes most of its gameplay inspiration from God of War. It's definitely got some rhythm to its combat, but it's very forgiving, and swinging the combat cross isn't the commitment to swing like Simon or Richter's whip is. These games were all great games, but they took their inspiration from other titles of the day. CV64 was the series' first entry into 3D, and they tried to make the series and say, what should this game be like in 3D, rather than what are other popular 3D franchises doing these days? And it's very important to look at competition and then self-reflect to see what you could do better. But in a strange way, CV64 and Legacy's quirks make them their own games. Call me a nostalgia huffer or say I'm on copium if you want, but I really like the N64 games as a genuine effort to be a translation of something to a new medium. Normally I talk about the future of the game here, but there hasn't been any re-release of Castlevania or Legacy to my knowledge. I have this memory of seeing the original 64 version being put on the Wii Virtual Console back in the day, but I wasn't able to verify that it was the N64 and not the NES version that was placed on the eStop. So if not, the game's never been re-released. Konami has allowed other companies to create re-releases of their other Castlevania games, but these two have yet to receive such treatment, and sadly, thanks to the game's somewhat unwarranted reputation, I don't know that they ever will. I'd almost pay full price for a remastered collection of Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness, but I don't really know how you would advertise such a package. Buy this great collection of two classic N64 games, the Director's Cut and the one with less content but different levels in some places. It made sense as the games were released, but I think it would be a hard sell in 2023. Thankfully, fans haven't forgotten about these two games. There are texture packs available for N64 emulators, and development of a randomizer is ongoing. There's also individuals working to break down the game's coding and files, and when that's done, there's no telling what sort of custom content will be available for these games. If you made it to the end of this beast, thank you from the bottom of my inventory for watching and listening. I hope you'll drop a like and sub and check out some of my other Castlevania content. But if not, that's fine too. Ships passing in the YouTube night and all that. I hope you go on to your next viewing experience with just a little understanding about why this clunky old 3D Castlevania game means so much to so many people.
Through a room